Where's Kristin? Kristin, are you there?
I
There
am
you are.
here.
Um, there you are, Kristin. Did I get your name correctly?
Oh,
Jack
very, very
Vonnie.
close. Jackvony is the
Vonnie,
last
Vonnie, Vonnie. Okay, there you go. I stand corrected. Yeah, so that's lovely. So, Kristin, I mean, I know this is a happy New Year to you, and
Happy
it's
New Year to you.
yes, happy New Year to you and everything. So it's good to have you, and I know you have a very good session here for our audience. So, just one question for before I let you go.
Sure.
As the question comes on, would you like me to read them to you, or you want to wait until the end of your presentation and then take questions?
I think if the questions come up, you can read them during my presentation, because I think we'll have enough time for that, and then we will also have time at the end too.
Okay, beautiful. So you heard it, folks. So you have a question, put it in the chat, and we'll get Kristin to answer them as we go along. So without further ado, over to you, Kristin.
All right. Well, let me start by sharing my screen. Okay. So in just a minute, you should see my PowerPoint. It's not, I'm not seeing it. Okay, there it is. All right. Hopefully you are all seeing it now too. Okay, so let me know if you are not seeing the screen, and we will get started. So thank you very much for that introduction, Larry. I am excited to talk to you about configuring Playwright for test automation success. And so, as Larry mentioned, I am the author of 2 books, The Complete Software Tester and Logical Fallacies for Testers. The Complete Software Tester is a book that is designed to help beginning and mid-level testers get up to speed on all different kinds of testing, including manual testing, writing test automation, API testing, security testing. It's really meant to be the complete picture. And then my book, Logical Fallacies for Testers, is a tiny little book that you could read in one weekend. And it's all about what logical fallacies are and how you can apply them when you are thinking about your software testing. So, I'm the creator of 2 courses, Monday Morning Automation on YouTube and Postman Essential Training on LinkedIn Learning. Monday Morning Automation is a completely free course, and it is designed to help testers from the very, very beginning who know nothing about test automation at all. It's to help them get started. There's about, I think, 53 lessons. Each of them are very short, only about 10 minutes. And it just really helps you get up to speed, and it's completely free. And then Postman Essential Training is a LinkedIn Learning course, and that teaches you all about API testing, how to set up API testing, what to test, and so on. So, and as Larry mentioned, my blog is called Think Like a Tester, which you can find at thinkingtester.com. And in my day job, I am the principal engineer 3 for software testing at Paylocity. And in that job, it is my responsibility to work with all of the different software teams and help them adopt good quality processes for all different kinds of testing. So here's our agenda for today. First of all, we will be talking about why Playwright. Why would we want to be using Playwright for our API and UI automation? And then we'll talk about the 4 different sections of the Playwright config file. And after that, we will learn about the most common features in each section. And then we will look at some examples of how you can configure projects in that config file to maximize your test effectiveness. So let's get started. First of all, why Playwright? Why might you want to use Playwright for your automated testing? Well, here are many popular reasons. It doesn't need a browser driver like Selenium WebDriver does. I've always found it really irritating when I'm using WebDriver. It seems like every other day it says, "Oh, sorry, your browser driver's out of date. Please update it." So I really like that Playwright works directly in the browser, so I don't need to install a driver. Playwright supports both API and UI testing. I am a huge proponent of API testing. I love that API tests are faster and more reliable than UI tests. So I'm really glad that it supports both right out of the box. Playwright supports all kinds of browsers, including Chromium-based browsers like Chrome and Edge, WebKit, which is Safari, and Firefox. It also supports mobile browser testing. This is not mobile native testing. This is when you have your application that works directly in the mobile browser. It supports that. It will emulate various mobile devices and screen sizes. It easily switches to iframes, tabs, and other browser windows, which we have found is a drawback of Cypress. There are ways to do that in Cypress, but they're not native and they can sometimes take a little configuring. But Playwright does those things right out of the box. Playwright supports intercepting and mocking API requests, which is super useful if you want to simulate, for example, getting a 500 error, and you might not be able to do that with the real API without taking your system down. Or if you are creating UI tests that are going to be built upon an API that hasn't been built yet, intercepting and mocking is really, really useful. Playwright also comes with many debugging tools. So if you are having a problem with your test, you can use several different methods to try and debug the problem. And finally, Playwright supports JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, Java, and C#. So it is extremely versatile in terms of programming languages. So another great thing about Playwright is that it is extremely configurable. You can set up your tests to run in lots of different ways. And you do that through the configuration file, playwright.config. But the configuration file can be intimidating just simply because of all of the different types of options that it offers. So what you see on the right, and it's very, very small, you don't have to be able to read it right now. I just wanted to show exactly what the whole config file looks like when you first spin up a Playwright project. So you'll get this Playwright config file. By default, there's 79 lines of code in it, and many of those lines are commented out. And in some of the comments, you'll be able to sort of figure out what it is that that configuration setting will do. But in other times, it's a little confusing. So I thought it would be a good idea to just take a really deep dive into the Playwright config file to show everybody how it's structured, what you can put in there, how the settings work, and how you can configure it to really make it work for you. It is actually possible to run Playwright tests without a config file. I tried this out in preparation for this presentation. What I did was I created a simple Playwright project and I just deleted the config file altogether. And then I went to run the tests, and the tests did run. They just ran with a whole bunch of defaults. But it is much, much better to learn how to use a config file and customize it to your advantage. So here are the 4 sections of Playwright config. First, there's the test configuration section, which has some general instructions for test execution. Then there's the use section that contains configuration settings for the tests. Then there's the project section, which is configuration settings for specific projects. And we will be talking about that word project and what it means in the context of Playwright. And then finally, there's the web server section, which includes instructions on how to start the development environment locally. So let's look at each one of these sections one at a time. So first, there is the test configuration section. These are the general settings. And there are many, many settings that you can configure in this section. And what I have included here are just the most popular ones. So we'll go through this little chart here, and I will show you what the configuration setting is named, what the definition is, and then what the default value is for the setting. So first we have the test dir configuration. So that stands for test directory. This points Playwright to the directory where your tests are located. By default, that's the tests file. But if you wanted to change that directory, if you wanted to have your tests named differently, all you would have to do is just change your configuration setting to point to the folder where you want Playwright to find your tests. Next, we have the forbid only configuration. So this is an interesting setting that you can use in Playwright, and here's how it works. Let's imagine that you have a bunch of Playwright tests, and one of them is failing, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. So you want to just run that test. You can set that test to be the only test that runs. So what you do is next to where it says test, on that particular test, you just add dot only, and then that test will be the only one to run when you run the npx playwright test command. So that's a really useful feature. But if you accidentally leave that dot only setting in there and then you commit your code, then when your tests are running in your CI environment, they'll only be running one test. So this forbid only setting, which you can see over here on the left, what it's set to right here is it's saying if you're using the CI environment and Playwright finds that dot only setting, it will fail the build so that you won't accidentally be only running one test with every run and thinking that everything is great when you're just running one test. So that's very useful. Our next configuration setting is the fully parallel setting. And in order to understand this, we need to think about how Playwright runs the files by default. So in Playwright, the default setting is the tests will run in parallel, but just one at a time in a file. So let's say if you had file A and file B, and each of those files had 5 tests in them. When you started up the test project, by default, it would run the first test in file A and the first test in file B at the same time. But it wouldn't start up test 2 until test 1 had finished. But you can set the configuration to be fully parallel, which means that it's going to run as many tests as it can in parallel. So with file A and file B, if you had 5 workers to run the tests, it might start up tests 1, 2, and 3 in file A and tests 1 and 2 in file B and run those all at the same time. So that brings us to the workers setting. So the workers are what actually runs the tests, like what kind of server is actually running those automated tests. And the definition of the worker setting is the maximum number of workers that will run your parallel tests. By default, that is 50% of the number of cores on your machine, which is kind of interesting. I think when I ran the test on my machine, and I have a Mac, I believe it was 5 parallels. It might have been 6 parallels by default. But you can set this to whatever makes the most sense for your local device and for your CI environment. So if you have, let's say, 6 workers set, and you've got that file A and file B that each has 5 tests in them, what will happen is the workers will start tests 1, 2, and 3 in file A, tests 1, 2, and 3 in file B. So you will have 6 tests running all at the same time. So next we have the retries setting. That's the number of retries for a failed test. So by default, that's 0. So that means if your test fails, it fails. But you can set it to have 1 retry, 2 retries, as many retries as you want. So that if you are using a flaky environment and you think, well, maybe it just failed because the environment flaked out, you can retry that test. And you can see over here on the left for retries right here, I've got it set in this particular line so that if it's the CI environment, it's going to retry twice. But if I'm running it locally, then it's not going to retry at all. So next we have the reporter. So that's the reporter to use when reporting test passes and failures. And Playwright is so great because it has 7 different types of reporters built in, and we will be talking about that in the next slide. So the default reporter in Playwright is list, and you can actually you can see over here I've set HTML to be the reporter in this particular configuration. And so we'll talk about what those things mean in the next slide. So then we have the timeout setting, and that is how much time to allow for a test before it fails because it took too long. The default value is 30 seconds, and that is set in milliseconds. So you can see over here, I have set the timeout to not be the default. I've set it to be 60 seconds. So let's just look a little over here at some of my other settings. We already went through some of them, but you can see the test directory right here. We talked about fully parallel. Here I've set that to true. We already talked about forbid only. And then for retries, I've got it set to 2 for the CI environment and 0 for running locally. And then for workers right now, I've got it set to just 1 worker for the CI environment and undefined for locally. And when it's undefined, that means it's just going to use the default number, 50% of the number of cores on your machine. And then I've got my HTML reporter set, and then I've got my timeout of 60 seconds set. So let's take a look at the reporters that are built in with Playwright. As I mentioned, there are 7 different reporters. The default one is the list reporter. And what that does is it just lists the tests in the command line and indicates for each test which ones have passed and which ones have failed. So it will include the name of the test and then pass or fail, and then the name of the next test and then pass or fail. So then there's the line reporter. This is a little more brief than the list reporter. In the line reporter, it displays only the count of passing and failing tests in the command line. So if you had 10 tests and 8 of them passed and 2 of them failed, it would just say 8 passes, 2 failures. And then if you want to get even more simple, there's the dot reporter. The dot reporter displays a dot for each passed test and the letter F for each failed test. So you can imagine if you had a couple hundred tests, you might not want to be filling up your command line with lots of information about what passed and what failed. You might just want to see just a little dot for each passed test and only an F for the failed test. And then that way, those Fs will jump out at you very quickly so you can see how many are failing. So then there's the HTML reporter, which is my personal favorite. This generates an HTML report. And each test in the report is clickable and it shows additional details about the test. So over here on the left, we've got the HTML report. And so this was a reporter that spun up after I ran my simple sample tests that I was creating in preparation for this presentation. So you can see up here on the top right that I had 6 tests that were run. I had 6 that passed, 0 failed, 0 flaky, and 1 test was skipped. And then here you can see the list of each test that was run with its name. You can see the check mark that shows that it passed. You can see what browser it ran on. This is the Chromium headless browser. And then you can also click through on each of these tests and get more information, depending on what was recorded during the test. And we will talk about recording tests a little later on in another config section. So this is super useful. When you click on it, it will provide you more information. It's especially useful if your test is failing. You can find out exactly where it went wrong. So then we have some other reporters. We've got a blob reporter, which generates a zip file that can be read with a JavaScript file reader. Then there's the JSON report. You can create the JSON report in the command line, or if you specify the name of a file, it will create the JSON report for you in that file. Same thing with JUnit. That creates a JUnit XML report. It creates it in the command line or in the XML file. Okay, next we are going to go on to the use section. So the use section is comprised of 5 different configuration types, and we will go through each one. First, we have the base URL and the storage state. So the base URL line sets the base URL for the tests. So you can see right here on the left, I've got base URL set to this URL. What that means is when you are writing your tests, you can assume that Playwright knows what the base URL is because it's set in the config file. So you don't have to type in every single one of your tests 127.0.0.1:3000. You can just navigate to the page that you want to run the test. So if you were going to a customers page, you would just navigate to /customers, and Playwright would know to populate that base URL first. Then there's the storage state configuration. And basically what that looks like is it points to a file in your complete Playwright project. And that file is where you might store your cookies or your tokens for your authentication. So if you have a test step that runs that authenticates a user and gets a cookie or a token back, you can save that cookie or token in that file. And then you can say, I want the storage state to point to this file. And then Playwright knows to automatically read from that file to get the authentication, which saves you time when you are running your tests because you're already logged in. So the next section of the use section is emulation options. And this is for setting device options such as screen size or locale or time zone. So this is really good for if you are testing an application that maybe shows something different depending on the locale. You could set your locale and then your test will automatically, when you go to that browser, it's automatically going to have that locale set for you. So right here on the left, I've got locale and I have set it to English and US. So then we have the network options. So these are options for ignoring HTTPS errors, using proxy settings, and accepting downloads. So here on the left, I have one example. I've got accept downloads set to true. So this would be useful if you are testing a web application that has an automatic download of a file. What you're doing here is you're telling Playwright, I want to accept the download that's going to happen automatically so I can continue using it in my test. Then we have the recording options. So these are the options for how the tests will be recorded. We will be talking about this more in detail in the next slide because this is a super useful feature. And then finally, we have the browser and action timeout. So these settings are for what browser to use by default, and then also what timeout to set for actions. Things like a click. You might set an action timeout so that if you are doing a click in your test and there's no response to the click within 2 seconds, your test fails. And for the default browser here, I've set browser name to be Firefox. That means unless there's any kind of override in the project section, which we will be talking about later, automatically it's going to use Firefox as the browser because I've set it here. So now let's talk about the recording options. So like I said, these recording options are super useful, especially in debugging. And there's 3 different kinds of recording options. So first we have the screenshot. So what that does is it takes a screenshot of the last event in the test and it saves it in the test results folder. And by default, this feature is off because it just, it uses file space if you are using the feature. So they want to have it turned off by default. And the options for this screenshot are off or on, which means every single test you run, it's going to take a screenshot of the last event. And then there's this only on failure option. So what that does is if the test is running and it fails, then it takes a screenshot and saves it. If the test passes, it does not. So next we have the trace recording. And the trace is like a GUI viewer where you can see everything that's happening in the test. You can see what's on the screen of the browser as the test is running. And then you can also see things like which test step is being run. And you can also see things like what kind of errors are coming back from the console or what kind of logging is coming back. So it's extremely useful. And so what this does is it saves the trace of the test in the test results folder. And then you can refer to it later, open it up and see what's going on. By default, that's off, but the options for that are off, on, retain on failure. So what that means is it's going to record the trace while you're running the test, but if the test passes, it's just going to delete everything because it knows you don't need it. But if the test fails, it's going to save it, and then you can refer to it in the test results folder. And then there's also a setting called on first retry. So that means if you have retries set up and your test fails and then the retry starts, it's going to start recording the trace on that retry. It's not going to do it the first time the test runs, but it will record on the retry. And then finally, we have the video recording option. So what this does is it saves a video of the test in the test results folder. Again, that's off by default because it's just going to be saving file space and saving computing time by not being on. You can have it set to off or on or retain on failure, just like with the trace. So it's not going to, it's going to record, but if the test passes, it will delete the recording. If the test fails, it will save it in the test results folder. Or you can have it set to on first retry, where it's not going to record the first time, but if the test fails and it's on a retry, then it will record. So you can see up here, this is what the configuration settings would look like, depending on what you chose. So right now I have chosen screenshot to be on. So that's going to take a screenshot with every single test. I've got trace set to retain on failure. So it's only going to save the trace if my test fails. And then I've also got it set to video. So it's going to take a video on the retry. Okay, so now we come to the most exciting part of the configuration file, and that is the projects part. So when I first started using Playwright, I was a little bit confused about the concept of project. When I heard someone referring to Playwright projects, I assumed that meant like the entire set of test automation code. You know, just like when you create software for a new application, you would call that a project. But project actually means something different in Playwright. What it means is a logical group of tests running with the same configuration. So you can set up a whole bunch of different kinds of projects in your test project, and then you can run only the projects that you want or that you need. So you can run your tests on all projects by using the npx playwright test command. It's just going to run everything. Or you can run just a very specific project or a specific set of projects. And you do that in the command line by using -- project. So here, if I said I want to just run my Chromium project, I would type npx playwright test and then -- project equals Chromium. There are many, many ways to configure projects, which is why they are so exciting. You can set what browser you want to use, generic browser, branded browser, mobile browser. You can configure the base URL so that it's different in each different project. You can set the number of retries so that they can be different in each project. You can set the timeout amounts. You can set which files you want to run and not run in your projects. And you can do that using the test match command or the test ignore command. So test match says, please match all of these files and run them. Test ignore is please ignore these files and don't run them. You can also set dependencies, which are projects that need to run before or after the project. And we will be talking about that in just a minute. So these are what the projects look like here on the left. You can see I've got 3 projects. One is called Chromium, one is called Firefox, and one is called WebKit. And for each one, I've got some different settings. I've got a different kind of browser that I'm using for each one. I've got, on this project, I want to ignore this test file right here. I'm saying don't run that one in this project. Here in my Firefox project, I've set I want to have 1 retry for every failed test. I'm here in my WebKit project. I've set a test timeout that's longer than the other ones. It's going to be 90 seconds instead of the default 30. So it's important to note that projects, the settings in a project will override the settings in the main section of Playwright config. So let's take a look at this example here. We've got a project called Firefox. And in my Firefox project, I've set the timeout to be 90 seconds. The default timeout for all of my tests is 60 seconds. So if I were running all of my tests and not the specific project, the timeout would be 60 seconds. But if I'm running this specific project, the Firefox project, the timeout here would be 90 seconds. So it's going to override the general settings. And now let's take a look at dependencies. So it's possible to set one project to be dependent upon another project running first. So in this example right here, I've got a project that I'm calling setup. And you can see that my test match is looking for this auth.setup.ts file, which is where I have my authentication steps. And here in my Chromium project, I have set setup to be a dependency or of this project. So what that means is when I start up the Chromium project, it's going to say, oh, this depends on the setup project, so we'd better run that first. Additionally, you can also set up a teardown project. So I've got a project here called cleanup, and the test match is delete.ts. So that's going to be the file that I run just to clean up all of my test data. So because I've configured that right here as the teardown project, then Playwright knows that after my tests run with this setup project, that then it's going to call the cleanup project. So what that looks like is this. Let's say I want to run my Chromium project. I would say npx playwright test -- project equals Chromium. And then when the Chromium project starts, it sees, oh, we got to be dependent upon the setup project. So it goes up here to the setup project. It runs the setup project. Then it runs the Chromium tests. And then it goes back and sees, oh, we've got to do a cleanup project. It goes to the cleanup project and it runs that. Very, very useful. Okay, and now we come to the final section of the Playwright config file, and that is the web server section. So this section contains instructions about how to start the development environment locally in order to run your tests against it. So this is super useful if you or your developer are making changes in the product code locally and you want to run your tests against that locally running code to make sure that you haven't broken anything. So what happens is when you start your Playwright tests, if it sees that there are instructions here in the web server section, it will start up the project. So the command instruction is the command that is used to start the server. Often especially in JavaScript, that would be npm run start. And then the URL is what gets returned once the server has started up. This setting here, reuse existing server, is useful because if it's set to true, what it does is when you go and you run the test command again, if Playwright sees that the server is already running, it's not going to kill the server and start it up again. It's going to say, oh, it's already running. I don't need to do anything. And then finally, the timeout setting tells Playwright how long to wait for the process to start up. So after 30 seconds here, it's going to give up and it's going to say something was wrong in starting the project. So let's put it all together. Let's see what it looks like when you have an entire Playwright config file. Now, what I've done here so that we could actually read the text is I've broken it up into 2 columns, but you can imagine that the section here in the second column would really be underneath the first column. So the very first thing in a Playwright config file is this import statement. So you want to import define config and devices from the Playwright test package. The next thing is the export default define config statement. And you can see our opening braces right here, and then our closing braces right here. So in between those braces are the 4 sections that we learned about. So first, there's the general section, and we'll just go through these, do a little review here. We've got our test directory, where to find the tests. I've got fully parallel set to true because I want my tests to run really fast, so I'm going to use a bunch of parallels. I've got my retries set so that it's going to retry once if I'm in my CI environment and no times if I'm running locally. I'm using the list reporter, and I've set the timeout to 60 seconds. So then we have our use section. In my use section, I have set the base URL, and then I've just set the trace recorder to on first retry. So when I'm running in my CI environment, if I need to retry a test, it's going to record the trace for me. Then I can go back and I can say, well, what went wrong with this test? And I can look at the trace to find out. So then we have the project section. For simplicity here, I've just set up 2 projects. One is the setup project, which is going to do my authentication. And then I have a Chromium project, which is going to run all of the tests on the headless Chromium browser. And then finally, I have the web server section, which is commanding how it's going to start up the web server to run locally. There's my URL that I'm expecting, and I want to reuse the existing server if it's set to true, which it is right here. So that's what it looks like all together. So now let's get into 3 different project configuration strategies. So you can set up your projects however you want to now that you understand all the different ways to configure them. And you could even use all 3 of these strategies in your entire Playwright code if you wanted to, or you could just pick one. So 3 common configuration strategies would be browser type. You could set your projects to run by Chrome, Firefox, Safari, or you could use a test type configuration where you've organized your projects by smoke or regression or feature. Or you could organize your projects by environment type, such as QA or stage or production. So we will look at one of these one at a time. We'll talk about why you might want to use that strategy, and then we'll take a look at what that strategy would look like. So first, the browser type configuration. So the browser type configuration is useful for when you have a heavy UI application. You have a lot of different things going on in the UI. You want to make sure that it's going to work on a number of different browsers. You might even have your application working on mobile browsers, so you would want to check to make sure that it was going to work on different mobile devices. So what would that look like? Well, here's a whole bunch of projects that I set with the browser type configuration. We start over here with the headless Chromium browser. So I've just named that project Chromium, and I've just said when we run the tests, we're going to use that Chromium browser. And then I have 4 different other browser types. I have the not headless Chrome browser, so I'm using the actual branded Chrome browser. And then here I'm using Edge. Here I'm using Firefox. Here I'm using Safari. So if I were to run all of these projects, I would be running all of my tests on all of those different browsers. But I've added more. I have added some mobile browsers. So you can see I've configured my tests in these projects to run on different emulations of the mobile browser. And these are all supported by Playwright. And I've just named them just what the name of the device is. I'm using some phones. I'm using some tablets. So we're going to get lots of different screen sizes here. So if I were to run all my projects in this particular Playwright project, if I said NPX Playwright test, then I would run every single one of my tests on every single one of these browsers, both web browsers and mobile browsers. So I would get a lot of information about how my UI was behaving. Then we have the test type configuration. So you might want to use this configuration when you have many, many tests, but you don't need to run them all with every test run. So for example, if you have 200 tests and your developer wants to deploy some code and they've checked in the code and the tests start up, but you've got 200 tests, they're going to have to wait a long time to get feedback. So you might want to specify running different tests at different times. So you might want to have smoke tests for fast feedback. So you would have a very small project that just had a few tests, and then you'll get feedback practically instantly. You could also use this if you have a specific regression suite that you want to run, depending on what feature has changed. So, for example, if somebody made a change to the customer feature and you had a whole suite of customer tests to do a full regression, you would want to be able to just run those tests and not anything else. So, let's see what that might look like. So here are some projects that I've set up, and I've got a smoke test project, a customer regression project, an inventory regression project, and then a full regression project. So for my smoke test project, I'm using the grep command to find the tests that I have tagged with smoke. And I will talk a little bit more about tagging in the next slide so you can see what that looks like. So this is going to run just my tests that I have tagged as smoke tests. So then I have a customer regression project set up here, and I've got it set to find anything that's been tagged with the customer tag. So if it's been tagged with a customer tag, we know it's part of the full customer regression suite. Same thing here for the inventory regression, only this time my tag is inventory. So that would run the whole inventory suite. And then for my full regression, you can see I'm not specifying any tests. So that means it's just going to run them all. And again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but to run a specific project, the way you do that is with npx playwright test -- project equals, and then the name of your project. So let's talk a little bit about test tagging. So here are a couple of sample tests. These are just tests that Playwright creates by default when you set up a new project. And so I've just practiced tagging them. In this particular test, I've tagged it with two tags. I've tagged it as smoke and I've tagged it as customer. So this is a test that I want to run every time I need a suite of smoke tests, but maybe because it's related to the customer, which this really isn't because it's just a sample test, but let's pretend that it is really related to the customer. I also want to have it run with my full customer regression suite. So that's why I've given it two tags. And you just put them right there inside the test title. You can even, if you want to, you can put them at the beginning of the test title. And when you use that grep command, it will find them. And then here with this test, I've just tagged it with one tag, and that's inventory. You can tag a test with more than one tag, as you've seen right here. You can also create a project that looks for more than one tag. So you can use the grep command in your project configuration, and you can say, I want to look for smoke tests and use this vertical pipe. Also look for the inventory tests too. And then you can also set the project configuration to match specific test files. As I mentioned earlier, there's commands test match and test ignore. So in this case, I'm using test match, and I'm looking for anything that says smoke.spec.ts. So this could be like customer smoke, or it could be basic smoke or whatever, but it's going to look for any files that have this regex match right here. So then we come to the environment type configuration for projects. So you might want to use this if you have tests that are going to be running in different environments, such as QA or stage or production. And each one of those environments will probably be using a different URL because you use a different URL to get to the QA environment than you do to the production environment. You might also want to use this environment type configuration if your environments behave differently. For example, if one environment is slower than other environments. And you might also want to use it if you want to specify different tests for different environments. You might want to run more tests in one environment and fewer tests in another. So let's see what that might look like. So we've got 4 different projects here. We've got 2 that are QA projects where we are expecting to run in the QA environment. And you can see I don't have a base URL set here, and that's because I'm just going to use the default base URL that I set up in my use section of my configuration. So one project is called QA Chrome. I'm going to run those tests in the Chrome browser. And then I've got this project here called Firefox, where I'm going to be running in the Firefox browser. And for both of these projects, I've set the timeout to be 90 seconds because my QA environment is kind of slow. So I want to give the tests more time to respond before they fail. And then I've also, because my environment in QA can be a little flaky, I've set my retries to 2. So if the test fails, I'm going to try it 2 more times before we say, oh, nope, definitely that's failed. So then I have my stage environment right here, and you can see that my base URL is different. That's going to point to stage.example.com to get to the browser and my app to test. And in the stage environment, I've decided I don't really need to run every single test. I think I just like to run my smoke tests and then maybe also my customer tests because those have been flaky lately. So I'm going to set a complete customer regression here. So it's going to look for just those test tags and run those tests. And I'm going to set the timeout here to be 60 seconds because this environment, while slower than production, it's not quite as slow as my QA environment. And then I've got my production project set right here where I've got my base URL is set to my production URL. And I only want to run my smoke tests here because I don't want to put any load on production. I want some really fast feedback here. So I'm just going to run my smoke tests. And I don't need to have anything other than the default timeout of 30 seconds because the production environment is fast. I'm also not expecting much flakiness, so I haven't set any retries here. So this over here on the left is what it looks like to run more than one project in the same command. So let's imagine, I didn't put them here because there wasn't quite enough room, but let's imagine we have 3 QA projects. We've got QA Chrome, QA Firefox, and QA Edge. And I want to run all of my QA projects. Maybe I've set them to run overnight or first thing in the morning. What I would do here is npx playwright test, and then I would do -- project equals QA Chrome, -- project equals QA Edge, -- project equals QA Firefox. So it will start all 3 of those projects and run all of the tests. And that is all I have for you today. I'm looking forward to taking your questions. But before I do that, I just want to review all of the different ways that you can connect with me and connect with my products. So you can find my Think Like a Tester blog at thinkingtester.com. You can connect with me on LinkedIn if you like, or on X. I post regularly on both of those. My book, The Complete Software Tester, is available on Amazon. That's available on both Kindle and in paperback. And remember, that's a book designed to help you get acquainted with all different types of testing, from API to security to performance to mobile and so on. My Logical Fallacies for Testers book is just a little book, 40 pages long. It's available on Kindle. It's a really quick read and a lot of fun. Then my Monday morning automation class is my free course on YouTube. And that is just 10-minute lessons, about 53 lessons. that will teach you from the very beginning to be a writer of test automation. And then my Postman Essential Training is on LinkedIn Learning, and that provides you with knowledge about how to set up API testing and what kinds of things you should be testing when you are testing APIs. All right, and that is all I have for you. So I will stop sharing and I will take any questions.
All right, that was wonderful. That was brilliant, and I have a few people who want to thank you for such a clear explanation of what all the thing that you went through. But before I jump into the, the questions, I actually have a question. You touch on a bit of everything. How easy it is to integrate Playwright into the CI/CD pipeline.
Okay. I will confess that I don't know a whole lot about that. And that is because there's another principal engineer that I work with who already for my company had set up that integration. So I don't have any experience with that, but I don't think he had any difficulty with that. And that might be something that you want to think about in your company, is to perhaps have one of your stronger automation engineers set up a project that others can clone and use. And then those configurations are all set up for them when they create their tests to run in the CI platform.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I have a question here from, I'm not good at pronouncing people's name, but I'll call him by his surname, by Mr. Wilson. He would like to know what advice would you advise having API and UI project in one code base in Playwright, given that the fact that it's supported?
Yes, I would advise that, definitely, because I think it's just much simpler to keep everything in one code base. I would also advise to keep your tests in the code base with the project code, with the actual application code, because then that way everyone on the team, from developers to testers, can understand what the tests are and contribute to them. They will know how to debug them if there's problems, and how to fix them, and how to contribute, add more tests. So how you would want to organize them would really depend on what you were using them for. I would, if I were running both the API and UI tests, I would probably have a separate folder for all of the API tests, and maybe even subfolders, depending on how much testing I was doing, maybe a subfolder for each endpoint. And then I would have a second folder, which would be for the UI test. So that would probably be like my first breakdown would be one top folder for API, one top folder for UI. But something else that is really interesting to think about is that you can use API commands to set up your UI tests. That is really, really useful. It saves a lot of time. So you can imagine if you were, let's say, running a test where you needed to have a new customer, but the test wasn't about adding the new customer. The test was about using the new customer. Instead of having UI steps to add the customer, which is kind of slow and sometimes flaky, you could use those API commands and just say, I want to post a new customer to our customer database. And then from that API command, you can go on and you can use your UI tests. So that is another strong argument for keeping those tests in the same code project.
Oh, that's good, and I kind of agree with you 100% on that one. It's good to keep your test code inside the project. Sometimes it's not that feasible, but it's a good thing. And let's talk about environment configuration. How do you look at, is there a difference between having API tests in Playwright and the configuration files? Do you have to have something separate for APIs as well as UI, or it could be one thing?
Yeah, probably, yep. So if you were running API tests, you would probably have different URLs for different environments, depending on what environment you are in. So like if you're hitting the API in your QA environment, that's going to have a different URL than if you're hitting the API in the production environment. Something else that you can do, which I didn't get into here, was you can have environment files set up for different environments. So rather than setting the base URL in the config file, you could have the base URL set in an environment file. So you might have like qa.env or stage.env or production.env. And in that file, you could have the all of your different configuration settings where you say for the API, it's going to point to this URL when we're in QA. For the UI, it's going to point to this URL when we're in QA. And then when you set up your test, what you do is you set up to read from whatever environment file you should use. So in your project, you can say, in my production, this is my production project, and I want my production project to read from my prod.env file to get my values. So you could do that.
Oh, brilliant. And just to add for all our people out there listening, the video, just think the videos for this will be sent out on the Testomatic YouTube channel, as well as will come via email. So that's just to put that out there one time. Yeah, and I mean, Kristin, back to you. I mean, and it's really good. So do you have how to say this? How do you tell somebody who now is new to using Playwright? What advice you have for them, coming into be a new person using Playwright from some other platform? What advice you have for them?
That is a great question. I found personally for me that learning Playwright was more difficult than learning Cypress, for example, which is what I was using before I switched to Playwright. Cypress was much more intuitive. Playwright, I had to think more like a developer. And so, oftentimes if I'm learning a new tool, what I do first is I download it and then I start just playing around with it a little bit. Maybe I look at the documentation. And for me, that wasn't enough to understand about Playwright. So I actually took a course. I took a Udemy Playwright course called Playwright from Zero to Hero. And that was really, really helpful because it presented the concepts that I needed to learn in a very systematic way, with examples that then built upon each other. So I guess my biggest piece of advice is if you want to learn Playwright, I would recommend finding a course and taking the course. It'll save you a lot of pain.
And interesting. I mean, it's just one of those things that you can't just jump into and read, because it's let's say complicated more than most.
Yeah.
I mean, like, all good things, isn't it? I mean,
oh yes, absolutely.
So you said, no, since you started using Playwright to do things, how do you find it cut down on the amount of work you have to do in relation to when you're using Cypress? And the follow-on question as well, so you can answer them all in one go, is why did you make the change from Cypress to Playwright?
So at my company, we started to make the change from Cypress to Playwright because of some of the features that Playwright offers that Cypress does not, or doesn't offer out of the box. Things like being able to change to different tabs and to different browsers easily. Playwright offers just a lot more configurability. I think Cypress is made, and I'm still a big fan of Cypress, by the way. I mean, I think it's an excellent tool, especially for new test automation engineers. Cypress makes it easy for you to set up your tests and find your elements and things like that. But sometimes when things are made easier, that also means that constrictions are added, where you might not have as much freedom to maybe set how you want to navigate to an element or how you want to interact with the element. You might, I can't think of a specific example of this beyond just like the browsers and the tabs, but I think Playwright just offers a lot more freedom and flexibility. And then, of course, the project configuration offers a ton of freedom and flexibility, which is really great. So that's why we started to make that change. Not all of our teams are using it yet, but they do know that Playwright is available. And, we've started to set up just projects that can be cloned and used and NPM packages that can be uploaded to help people get started. In terms of ease of use, just for my own personal use, I would say Cypress is easier. Cypress is easier to get started. But Playwright is much better for debugging. And it also just allows that more greater flexibility.
I mean, and just before we go and you have your final thought, I want one little small question is, in terms of everything that you have in using both Cypress, Playwright, and I'm sure you use others as well. And I heard you announce a lot of them. What are some of the advantages, just off the top of your head, of Playwright over any other one for that matter of fact? Just some of the advantages.
Yeah, so I think the biggest advantages are, my favorite is that you don't need a browser driver. I hate the browser driver. I
Brilliant.
mean, maybe that's just me, but I really hate the
Brilliant.
browser driver. So I love being able to just run directly in the browser right out of the box. So that's a big thing. And then I think the other thing is all of the different ways that you can debug your tests and also the different ways that you can run your tests. I've been using Playwright with Visual Studio Code, and there's a Visual Studio Code plugin that allows you to run the test just directly from that console, from the IDE. There's a section that you can go to called tests. And so you can just say, oh, I just want to run this test. And you just click the little play button and it runs. So you can run them that way. You can open up a whole GUI interface, just like you would see with Cypress. You can run them that way. There's just a lot of choices. And then for debugging, you can debug just the way you would like regular like production code. So you can set up a debug breakpoint. You can create log statements really easily, more easily than in Cypress. So that those I think are the biggest advantages.
All right, thanks for that, and thank you for being here and presenting. And I'm sure, and from the comments, a lot of people find it very, very useful. So they're saying thanks a lot for that. And yes, it was really lovely having you on. And
Thanks for having me.
yeah, thank you. And it was good. And maybe next time, we could do this again, and you could extend what takes place with, and give us some more insight into Playwright.
Sure.
Thank you so much.